This is how I made my ankh belt.
In my opinion, this was a pretty beginner-friendly project.
I'm using a 2-part silicone mix, and I already had most of the supplies. The only thing I had to buy was the heat gun, and I'm using a box and hot glue to hold the silicone. I wish I would have not used foam. I'm just using a thick craft foam, and I'm hand drawing the shape out. You can use a printed one, but I recommend using air dry clay for casting your shape. The foam held up really well, but it did come out with a weird scratchy texture on the top of it, and I would have preferred it to be smooth. Air dry clay might be a little bit easier to use anyways, because you won't have to go through the trouble of trying to cut it out and sand it, which I had to go through. It did not come out fully smooth, so I had to do a lot of extra sanding at the end. This is my ankh shape, and I really like how it came out. Now I'm making the cardboard frame that will hold my 2-part silicone mixture. You'll want this box to be very waterproof because it's going to be holding the silicone mixture. I'm just using a scrap cardboard box and some hot glue. You'll want your box to be a little bit bigger than your desired ankh shape so it can have a little extra give to the mold. Once you have your box formed, you're going to want to glue your ankh down. I'm also hot gluing it. I left some room on the side so it'll have more space to form the mold around my shape. Anytime you use resin or any 2-part mixture, you really want to have gloves on for this. You don't want to develop contact dermatitis. It can cause allergies if you touch it to your bare skin. Also, making sure you have proper air ventilation. And at this point, I'm just pouring the silicone part A and B mixture together. You want equal parts of both. And the way you mix resin and this type of mixture really matters. You want to go slowly in scraping and making sure you don't form any more air bubbles than you need to. When you stir, you create a little bit of air going in, so you don't want to add a lot. And I'm also using a lighter to pop the air bubbles. I did a poor job of showing this, but you're going to want to pour the liquid right on top of your mold. You want to make sure you fully cover your mold. And I'm also using a heat gun to make sure it dries properly. This is how your mold should look. I wish I had poured more product on top of it because it was a little thin, but it still held up. I left it to cure for a few days, and this is how it resulted. The shape came out exactly how I wanted, but the edges were a bit rough. The surface was a bit textured as well as the results of using foam instead of air dry clay. I was able to file away all the texture at the end with a nail file. I didn't have any sandpaper. Bonus points if you have a Dremel because I think that works even better. Now comes the resin. I did this in 2 layers of curing. I started by adding slowly, but the first layer is going to be a bit thicker. You want to pour your resin along the shape of your mold, just a little bit in each spot, and then I kind of swish it around in the mold. But first, I'm just going to place it down just a little shallow amount that I can swish around in the mold to fill it in every corner. So I'm just going to be tilting slowly back and forth, going in each spot and adding more resin if I need to in certain areas. And right before you cure, every time you either want to take a lighter or a heat gun to heat it up to pop the bubbles, and you want to let it cure. You want it to cure fully before adding another layer. So for my second layer, this is where I add the eye pins. I bend them just a smidge bit down. I bent them a millimeter lower to allow room for the resin to rise. I don't want the resin to close the eye pin holes. And I'm going to snip off the ends because they don't need to be that long, but once I place them in the resin, I add a little bit on top, swoosh it around, and then I use my lighter to warm it up to pop any of the air bubbles. This is going to be the second and final layer to the shape. You can do more layers if you want, but I chose to do it in 2 layers just so it cures fully. I found that they cure faster if you work in layers. I usually just do 2 or 3. You really want to make sure before every time you cure, you pop the air bubbles with either a toothpick, lighter, or heat gun. I let this one cure under UV light a little bit longer, and I'm using UV gel. I got this one at Michael's. A lot of my supplies are either from Michael's, local hardware stores, or craft stores. I try to shop local. Some of it's from Michael's. There's also a few items from Amazon as well. All of the chain and craft supplies that I used to make the jewelry part was thrifted from either yard sales or church sales. Those tend to be the best place, especially old lady yard sales have a lot of craft supplies typically. This was my first attempt of making a silicone mold, and it did take me 2 attempts to get the ankh fully smooth and shaped the way that I'd like it. I prefer UV resin over regular air dry resin. I found it's a little bit more finicky to get the 2-part mixture, and there's a lot of factors of it just not curing properly. I've had a lot more luck with UV resin. I'm still pretty new to making resin crafts as a whole, so I was very surprised at how easy it was to make a silicone mold. I thought it would be a little bit more difficult. And for UV resin, it's a little bit easier if you work in layers, as opposed to making it all in one layer and relying on the lamp to cure it all at once. I've had significantly less air bubbles and issues with it being brittle when I work in multiple layers of curing. I didn't have any issues with air bubbles, and I think it's because I was using a candle lighter to pop them before putting them under the lamp to cure. And I'm moving the mold around to make sure that it's all getting evenly in every corner. I let gravity and the product do its thing and just move along in every groove and crack and make sure it's all one even layer. You can build up as you go. It's easier if you start shallow and work with a little bit and add more as you need. I'm just taking my time with it. I don't want to form any more air bubbles. If you move it around too rapidly, you can form more. I didn't notice any air bubbles in any of my ankhs. I'm just using a regular candle lighter and it was really effective at getting out all my air bubbles. And then I leave it to cure for about a minute and a half. Sometimes I do longer. The second layer is when I really like to add the longer cure time to make sure that it's fully done and there's not any sticky parts. The second layer is also when I add the eye hooks. I don't add them in the first layer because I don't want them to sink to the bottom and close the eye, but I also don't want them having a little bit of metal peeking out because that can cause it to bend and break. I do really want this jewelry to be sturdy because it'll be worn as a belt. I used a toothpick to arrange the eye hook and I poked it through at the end just to make sure that there was no resin stuck in the eye. After placing down the hooks, I could also add a little bit of resin on top, just a drop on either side. And I cured them with a flashlight just to make sure that these eye hooks were not coming out and that the metal was fully covered. I decided not to use any resin dyes. I felt that we're not coming out pigmented enough. I did attempt to add red resin dye instead of acrylic paint, but I felt like it was still too opaque. And I wanted to paint them at the end with acrylic paint, just I felt that looked a little bit better. You could also do silver or pink or black or whatever kind of paint you want. You could spray paint them, you don't have to use acrylic paint. You could even leave them clear if you'd want. I added glitter to one of mine and it looked really cool. I would love to see a pastel goth make their interpretation on the ankh belt and do like pink or something. Pink and green would be cute. I just went with red because a lot of my clothes are already black, so it would blend in if it was all black. I made 6 ankhs and then I just used a regular chain and a lobster clip to hold them together as a belt. When they first come out of the mold, they're a little bit rough and not exactly how I'd like them to be shaped. And because I didn't use air dry clay and I used craft foam instead, it came out textured on the front, so I will be filing off that. I had to redo my first mold because I used cardboard and taped up the edges. Next time I make a silicone mold, I know to use air dry clay instead of craft foam or cardboard. This is how all 6 of the ankhs came out. The far red stained one is from the resin dye I tried to mix, but I ended up changing my mind on, and I decided that I'd rather paint them red at the end. So I'm just using acrylic paint and then I'm using Mod Podge to top it off to make sure it's sealed. Overall, I'm really happy with the way this looks. They feel super durable. They're thin, but they're not heavy. The resin itself feels really sturdy. I decided to use a matte Mod Podge. You could use glossy, you could use metallic paint, you could spray paint these. Overall, this was a decently easy craft. It was pretty relaxing. The longest part was waiting for the silicone mold to dry. I used my heat gun to get these to dry faster, so then I could get started on the belt. I'm just using a basic chain, a lobster claw, and some jump rings, and I decided to make rings of 3 between every ankh. So I'm just putting 1 open in the middle and I'm linking up 2 on the sides. Since there are 6 ankhs, I only needed 5 rings of 3. Once I have all 5 of my sets of 3 prepped out, I'm going to start attaching the ankhs together. The middle jump ring will stay closed and the 2 on each end will open for each side of the ankh. And basically we're making a chain of all the ankhs. That will be the front portion of our belt. And from there you can decide if you'd like your belt to attach at the side and have like a long dangling chain, or if you would like it to meet at the middle. It's up to personal preference. You can decide that on your own for what fits your needs. That's kind of the fun part about DIY is you can customize it as much as you'd like and make it fit your needs, whether it's not a part of the original design. Now that I'm attaching the ankhs together, I really want to make sure these jump rings are sealed tight because they are holding like a heavier charm and that I'm going to be wearing it. The resin ankh charm does have a little bit of bend to it, So I'm gonna wanna make sure that my charm is able to be held tightly by a jump ring and that it's not gonna break on my waist. I plan to keep making DIY fashion videos on things you can make instead of buy. If there's anything you've been wondering how to make but you're not quite sure, please let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear any suggestions. So I've got my ankh chain formed. This is gonna be the front of my belt, and then I'm gonna have it attached to the side with just a chain and a lobster claw. You could add like an extra charm to dangle at the bottom of the extra chain if you would like. I attach a few jump rings to the side with the ankhs, and then I attach the lobster claw to that side, so that way the lobster claw can hook onto the chain and the belt can be adjustable. I think this can easily be adapted to any size. I could make the ankhs bigger or smaller, or even add more charms if I needed to. The chain length and the lobster claw makes this belt adjustable. Sometimes I may want it smaller depending on wearing a corset or not, and then other times I may want it bigger if I'm wearing it more as a waist belt. It's turned out exactly how I wanted it to. I think it looks amazing over a corset. I could even wear it in different styles. Here's the back and then the side. I think it's easy to add more charms or customize it. I think it's literally perfect.